for a long time, but for a short period, if I'm not breathing in or breathing out, that means there is some apnea is present. There is another thing that is called sleep. During sleep, this respiratory tract may become blocked, and there is also another thing is just a moment. Oh, sorry. I heard some sound. Now, this sleep apnea, they are having two types of sleep apnea. One is called obstructive sleep apnea, another is called central sleep apnea. In obstructive sleep apnea, what happens that a person, when he is lying in a supine position, the airway, because of its own weight, it reduces its diameter. So what happens? The effective diameter that becomes lesser, and the air that should pass through the respiratory tract becomes lesser, and that creates a problem. There is another apnea that is called central sleep apnea. In central sleep apnea, what happens? Our brain that is not sending the sufficient neural signal to the respiratory system so that our lungs can inflate. That is another type of disease. Now, in both of these conditions, there is one therapy that is called oxygen therapy. In oxygen therapy, what happens? A person is given an additional oxygen. Now, here we need to, here we should remember that additional oxygen we cannot give 100% oxygen to a person, because if I am breathing 100% oxygen, my body thinks that I don't need to, I need to do any respiration. Because our oxygen saturation becomes 100%, our body thinks that there is no need to take the air from outside. So unless we take air from outside, we cannot exhale the air. So that means what happens, that the carbon dioxide inside our lungs that start building up, and it leads to a carbon dioxide poisoning. That means our body's pH balance becomes different, and it creates another kind of problem. Now, there is another therapy is also there that is called continuous positive airway pressure therapy. Continuous pressure airway, positive airway pressure therapy, what it does, it exerts a continuous positive pressure. Means a person suffering from this disease, obstructive sleep apnea, he is diagnosed with a disease, and the doctor suggested him to take a therapy that is called continuous positive airway pressure therapy. In this therapy, what happens, that the patient gets to wear a mask, and an expert, he sets an additional pressure, what will be the baseline pressure. That means when I'm trying to inhale the air from external environment, there is some pressure, there is some pressure gradient that I'm creating. That means in our external environment, if I consider the external pressure is 760 millimeter mercury, and that and I have created some lesser pressure inside my lungs so that the airflow is occurring. Now, in continuous positive airway pressure therapy, what happens? The pressure is increased, like from 760 millimeter mercury, it is increased to like 800 millimeter mercury, and with that base pressure, the respiration is conducted or respiration is done. Now, set means in these two conditions that I have discussed, this additional oxygen or this continuous positive airway pressure, they are all very much dependent upon a person. Means you cannot say a person that you do whatever you want. I am giving you an oxygen tank, or I am giving you a CPAP therapy machine, and you work anyway, whatever way you want. It is not like that. There must be some expert involved. That expert decides, or a clinician is involved. The clinician decides how much oxygen a person is supposed to breathe, or how much continuous pressure that person should get. Without this means some optimization thing, that cannot be means effective therapy. The oxygen one I have discussed that if I give additional means 100% oxygen to a person, there will be a carbon dioxide buildup. Similarly, the positive airway pressure that I give is more than a determined value. What happens? The lungs that will burst. And if I give a lesser pressure, that will also be not effective, or the therapy the therapy will not be effective. So means you see there will be always be a balance. When I am giving an additional oxygen, or when I am giving an additional pressure, there must be some balance. It cannot be lesser than some value, it cannot be greater than some value. Now, usually how it is done, or how the clinician does this thing, is by having an expert clinician, and they set that how much pressure or how much oxygen the person is going to get. Now, if we want to automate this process, we need some kind of physiological system, or we need some kind of modeling of the physiological system. Usually what happens, or nowadays or currently, the devices available in the market, they use some kind of physiological signal, and once we get the signal, we process the signals, and then we determine that how much oxygen we need to take, or how much additional pressure. But when we give them with some mathematical modeling, it will give some solid backbone to the device. And it will also give a additional safety measure, because you see in physiological or in medical devices, the safety features, they are the most important thing. Okay. So let us go to the respiratory system. Just a moment. Now we'll go into the respiratory system. The respiratory system, what is the purpose, or what is the major function of respiratory system? One function that is clear, that our respiratory system is inhaling the air or exhaling the air. That is the exchange of gas with the outside environment. But also it needs to maintain the condition, oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration inside body. Because if some of this value changes, means the respiratory system will not only be affected, it will affect the cardiovascular system, it will affect the neural system, all the system will become affected. So the equilibrium condition maintaining, that is also done by the respiratory system. It is something that is inherent to the nature, means there is no human is involved in this system's function. This is what is the system is doing. Then there is another function, that is raising the temperature. Raising the temperature means our ambient temperature is kind of like 35 degrees centigrade or 30 degrees centigrade. Sometimes it is lesser, sometimes it is higher. But what happens, our core body temperature, that should always be at a constant value. Now, if I inhale a cold air for a long time, I might get a fever. Or if I breathe with a higher temperature or a higher temperature air, that will also be a problematic. So usually what happens, our body temperature, or the core body temperature, that is usually higher than the ambient air. So when we breathe in, one of the major objective of the respiratory system is it has to be, the temperature has to be raised so that it can match with the inside body, the core body temperature. And also there is another function, that is humidifying and filtering. Now humidifying and filtering, what is the purpose? Because you see in our human body, there is more than 90% there is water is there, and the air we are breathing in, they are mostly kind of dry water, a dry air. Unless the air is humidified, we cannot, or our lungs will become dry within minutes. So the respiratory system, that the function of the respiratory system is humidify. And also filtering means, you see there are some ciliary or some ciliary movements are there that filters the air. There is some mechanical filters are there. Another function, that is the regulation of the pH. Means there are many more functions of the respiratory system. These are the major functions, or that we want to describe, or that we want to capture through our model. There is another function, that is the regulation of the pH. pH decides the whether whether a person's blood, that is acidic or alkali. If it is alkalic in nature, then means there is some specific pH value that needs to be maintained. Kind of like 6.3 is the normal pH value. If the pH changes, how the pH changes by the carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, when mixed with water, it creates an acid, carbonic acid. Now, if the carbon dioxide is higher, that means the pH becomes lower. In that way, the regulation of the pH, that is also one of the major function of respiratory system. Now, I will discuss about what is the physiology of the respiratory system. Physiology means anatomically, you see, there are lungs is there, and there are some blood vessels. Means the air we are taking in, that air is mixed with the blood in the lungs, and then it is circulated to the whole body. Now that is the anatomy. Now what is the physiology? Physiology means how these systems are interconnected, and this interconnection, that is only means best described by the control system block diagram. Means this is not a block diagram, but rather this is one of the schematic diagram. The schematic diagram tells us that how this different interconnection of the systems are going on. So first we have our external environment, and from the external environment through the airway, or this piston that represents the breathing. If the piston goes in the airway, this volume becomes lower, so the air is exhaled. If the piston goes downward, the airway becomes expanded, and the air comes into the airway. Once it comes into the airway, there is the oxygen and carbon dioxide is exchanged. Now, airway and lungs, they are not physically separate things. But for sake of understanding what people did, or how the literature suggests, is that we divide the whole system into three different parts. One is called the mechanical plant, another is called the chemical plant, another is the respiratory center. These three major systems are there. They are responsible for doing all the objectives what we discussed earlier. Now the mechanical plant is not a very difficult thing, that what we can understand from outside of the body, that it is inhaling or exhaling. But the chemical plant, that is this plant, that is the most important plant that is working behind the scene. But it is creating, or it is maintaining the oxygen and carbon dioxide content in the blood. Now to model this chemical plant, what the literature suggests, that we divide the whole body into three parts. One is called lungs, one is brain, another is rest of the body. Now once this oxygenated air leaves the lung, it goes to the left heart. And after the left heart, it goes through the aortic and carotid arch, where the peripheral chemoreceptor is located. And after that, it is branched. One part goes to brain, another part another part goes to the body. In brain, there is a area, or anatomically there is one area that is called medulla and pons area, where we have the central chemoreceptors. Okay, there are two physical chemoreceptors are there. One is near the aortic and carotid arch, that is called peripheral chemoreceptor. One is near the medulla and pons area, that is called a central chemoreceptor. Now, then the circuit is closed again, means the blood flow, it goes again through the right heart and goes to the lungs. That is how this blood flow loop is completed. Now, from here, the peripheral chemoreceptor and central chemoreceptor, there is some nerve endings are there. those nerve endings, they are taking the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration to the respiratory center. And the respiratory center that determines that how much or what should be our breathing rate or what should be our breathing depth. Means the rate means per minute a healthy person takes around 12 breaths. And depth wise, there is one term that is called tidal volume, that how much air a person is breathing in. In normal condition, it is around 500 milliliter. Now, the respiratory center that decides that depending upon this oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration inside from this central chemoreceptor and this peripheral chemoreceptor, that what should be the rate of breathing and what should be the depth of breathing. If it happens that the oxygen becomes lower, then shall the respiratory center increase the rate or shall it increase the depth? Understanding this thing that requires a understanding of the mathematical relation, that if the oxygen is increased in this peripheral chemoreceptor, how this respiratory center will behave, or if the oxygen is increased here in the brain compartment, how this respiratory center will behave. So there are these two sensors are there, two sensory locations are there, and here this oxygen and carbon dioxide, they depict that due to the oxygen and carbon dioxide, they are used in our body for metabolism. That means that the cells, they take up some oxygen, do the metabolism, and the carbon dioxide released into the blood. The same thing happens in brain compartment and the body compartment. Now here one thing is to remember is that the central chemoreceptor, they can only sense the carbon dioxide concentration. And the peripheral chemoreceptor, they can only sense, or they can sense both oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration. In essence, there is only one oxygen sensor in our body, but two carbon dioxide sensor in our body. So this two information, or this information from oxygen and carbon dioxide, they comes to the respiratory center, and that signal goes via phrenic nerve to our lungs, and that accordingly our lungs expand or contract depending upon what are the signals coming through this phrenic nerve. And for the sake of continuation, there is one kind of receptor cells are also there inside lungs, that is called pulmonary stretch receptors. These pulmonary stretch receptors, they are kind of mechanical stop. Mechanical stop means that our human, for example, you can correlate to this thing when we are running or we are doing some exercise. When we are doing some exercise, our body's demand for oxygen becomes large, but we cannot take some or we have some limit over which we cannot cross. So that is caused by this pulmonary stretch receptors. Those stretch receptors, they see that the lungs has this maximum, this much capacity. It cannot grow beyond that. If it grows beyond that, the chest cage become bursted. So what happens is that this stretch receptors, they send some signal back to the respiratory center that yes, enough, the lungs has been inflated enough, it cannot inflate more. So you stop inflating this. See, so that is how these receptors, they're telling the respiratory center that how or in which way it should enable the respiration. So there are some mechanical parts are there, some chemical plants are there, some neural parts are there, and together all these things are creating or maintaining the homeostasis. So let us come to the mathematical modeling part. Mathematical modeling, it is describing this mathematical modeling in this short time, it is very difficult. But anyway, I will try to give you some touch, or I will give you some glimpse of how these modelings are done. Now you see, at the beginning I told you that there are two types of modeling approaches are there. One is called top-down another is bottom up. This top-down approach that tells us that we start from top and work our way to bottom. But in reality, what happens is that means we cannot stick to one kind of modeling approach. We have to do we have to do something from bottom up, we have to do something from top up, and a mixed modeling approach is provided. So now, for the respiratory system, how it is done, the entire system is divided into 3 parts. And for each of these 3 parts, we provide we develop the mathematical model, and we design or we hypothesize some way how these 3 systems are working together in tandem. So one part is the breathing mechanism that we told earlier, that is the mechanical plant, and there is another is the chemical plant that regulates the oxygen and carbon dioxide, and another is the neural control. Now, in literature, what we will find that there are many papers they only deal with the breathing mechanism. There is some paper they deal with only this part, regulation of the oxygen and carbon dioxide, and there is some papers or literatures they will develop or they will discuss only about neural control. Now, all these things are related to the respiratory system. But when we want to talk about respiratory system, we need to consider all these 3 things together. And there are also some papers or some literatures they describe or they take into account all these things together. That is called, those are integrated model. But for the sake of simplicity, I am going through this one as individual modeling approaches. Now, this is the breathing mechanism. Breathing mechanism means, you see, there is one thing you must understand, that when we want to model a system, there is, we want to develop a mathematical description, and we need to understand what is the input and what is the output. So for a breathing mechanism, the input is our mouth pressure. Mouth pressure means the pressure that is exerted at the end of the mouth, and that input is creating the flow. You see, when we divide our whole system into 3 parts, that means this mouth pressure is generated by the nervous system. This mouth pressure is an output of the nervous system, but that becomes as input for the breathing mechanism or the mechanical part, and that is creating the flow. So for the input is mouth pressure and the output is flow. So for the breathing mechanism part. Once we consider this input and output, the most simplistic model of this one we represent in this way as mouth pressure. E is the elastance, elastance, and R is the resistance of the airway. This is a differential equation, and we can represent it in the state space format also. So this is one of the most simple model available. So when V dot V remember that there is a V dot is there, that is the air flow, and V is the volume. As if we take the integration of this, we get the volume. Now there are some complicated models also. This complicated model, I did not want to give you the mathematical description. I have given the paper from where we got this model. This is a complicated model. You can understand that here the input is mouth pressure, and the output is flow. You see, there are different that is the point of discussion of this thing. A mathematical model, it can be a very simple, like in a one-line equation you can make, or it can be as complicated as this one. So you'll see later that the models, as the system goes bigger, the models become more difficult to understand, or models become more complex. I will not go into detail of this one, but this is kind of they have developed this model for a separate purpose. Now this is the output, or this is the input and output waveform of the breathing mechanism that I wanted to show you, that during the inspiration, how this pressure is going and how the pressure is being maintained, and how this expiration, the pressure is going. Okay. So the pressure, when we are inspiring, the pressure is having a ramp-like architecture. During the pause, it maintains a constant pressure, and during expiration, it is exponentially decaying. As these are the input, the outputs, the flow, that is a constant flow. During the pause, it becomes a zero flow, and then it goes to the negative direction. Okay. So that is how this waveform looks like. During inspiration, the pressure is in a ramp phase, but the flow is it is in a step signal. Okay. Now this is only for you to understand or for you to grasp that how this respiratory system they are working, or how the input and output signal looks like for this system. Okay, now I will briefly describe the neural control. Neural control, there are many theories, because you see the neural control, there is a very difficult to understand from the external environment. When we want to discuss this neural control, we want to discuss the working of a part inside our brain that is called respiratory central pattern generator. In simple, it is called RCPG. RCPG, because physically we cannot assess the working of this part, because you see this particular part that is inside our brain, and we cannot stick a needle inside a human's body to get the input output characteristics. But still, means there are many hypotheses, or there are lots of hypotheses there about how this part works. Some hypothesis tells that our RCPG works for optimization of chemical plant and mechanical plant. Some hypothesis tells that there is some limit cycle operation is going on. Some hypothesis tells that there is some nonlinear oscillator. I told you as limit cycle. There are some other theories also there. Some say that it optimizes the arterial carbon dioxide. Some says that it optimizes the arterial oxygen. So there are lots of conjectures and theories are there that about how this system is modeled. So one of the simplest model that we found, or that we work with, that is called the Leonard oscillator. Leonard oscillator, that is one of the generalized form of the Van der Pol oscillator. This Van der Pol oscillator, that is a subset of this Leonard oscillator. Now, if we change this A and B here, that will change our frequency and form factor. So here there is a simulation that how this Y changes with different A or B. Okay, so I will not go into much detail of this one, because this RCPG, they are very much a active research area, and there is beyond the means when we want to focus on the respiratory system, only focusing on respiratory pattern generator, that becomes difficult. Now we come to the part chemical regulation. So chemical regulation, as we have seen, that there are three compartments: brain, lungs, and body tissue. The lungs, they are the gateway to the external environment. So that means our oxygen is coming and inspired, carbon dioxide is also inspired, and it is expired also, or exhaled from the lungs. Now the blood that is coming into the lungs, that is mixed with oxygen and going to the left heart, and it is divided into brain and blood, a body. Now here there are some assumptions. What we need to understand is that in the previous slides, in the breathing mechanism, we have seen that the flow that can be bidirectional, means that When it is in inspiration phase, the flow is positive. When it is expiration phase, the flow is negative. Okay. So now considering this factor, if we want or if we go for modeling this one, chemical regulation, it becomes very difficult to model. So that is why what people do, they do a airflow, it is considered as unidirectional. And there is a variable that is called minute ventilation. Minute ventilation is nothing different. Minute ventilation is something that is when you multiply the tidal volume with the respiratory uh, frequency. That means your respiratory frequency multiply means in 1 minute how much air you are breathing in. That is the controlled variable here. So if we multiply the tidal volume with the respiratory frequency, that gives us the minute ventilation. Okay. Okay, and there are two chemoreceptors: central chemoreceptor, peripheral chemoreceptor. And this modeling approach, what we are showing here, that is from one of the famous work by Milhorn. And there is one guy named Guyton. Guyton and Hall medical physiology book, you might have heard. That physiology book, it is still very much important. Now, when we discuss about regulatory system, there are two types of modeling approaches are there. One is called comprehensive model, another is called minimal model. Here I have shown you that if we want for respiratory system, if we want a minimal model, we only consider this much, this dotted part. But if we want a comprehensive model, we need to consider the whole thing. Now, what is the difference between these two, comprehensive model and minimal model? A minimal comprehensive model is something that encompasses all the possible scenarios. That means if you want to model a system, all the possibilities you take into account and then you create a model that is called a comprehensive model. But if you want to create a model that you want to validate certain hypotheses, then you need to you don't need to take all the system into detail. All the detailed system you don't need to take into account. Rather, you take only that much part that is relevant to you or relevant to your hypothesis. And those kind of model that is called minimal model. So in the literature, there are lots of means for every system you'll find that there is some minimal model is there, some comprehensive models are also there. Now, this Milhorn model, what I'm discussing, that is a comprehensive model. Now, comprehensive model, there are some assumptions. Blood continuous airflow, we have discussed. Blood flow to the brain. Now, the heart that is pumping the blood, that is function of arterial and the carbon dioxide content inside the artery. The minute alveolar ventilation or the minute ventilation, that is also the function of carbon dioxide and oxygen. And the gray type controller that I will not go into much detail, but rather the neural control what I have discussed, there are many types of conjecture that I told. So this is another type of conjecture that is called a gray type controller. And the system is a nonlinear system and time invariant system. That's how they propose this system. Physically, this is nonlinear system, but time variant also. But for understanding purposes, this is nonlinear and time invariant. Also, there is another thing. There is a delay involved in the system. The delay. Let me give you a slight hint or slight this one, that when the blood leaves this left heart and it is reaching this peripheral chemoreceptor, it has some delay associated with this. So similarly, the blood leaving this left heart, it reaches the central chemoreceptor. There is also another amount of delay associated with this. Okay. And there is a famous experiment by one scientist called Guyton. What he did was he took a dog. Nowadays, it is not allowed or it is non-ethical. But in earlier days, there were several this kind of experiments were done where the scientist, they took a dog and they increased the length of the artery by artificial tubes. What they did was they take out the artery coming out from the left heart, and they inserted a physical or a outside tube, and that outside tube is connected to the brain artery. Now what it did, it 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 effectively, means it is effectively taking the blood from heart to the brain, but with a longer path or in a longer path, and that is creating a longer delay. And they found that as the delay becomes longer or delay becomes higher, the dog is suffering from another the similar kind of pattern that is called periodic breathing, what the pilots used to go or pilots used to experience in the higher atmosphere. Okay, so they found that the giving a longer delay, that also creates this periodic breathing pattern. Now, coming back to the regulatory system model, they are all compartmental model, and compartmental model, they are all formulated based on this basic formula. The basic formula is that you take change of volume of a gas inside a reservoir and the rate of change of that, ddt of that, rate of change of that, and now you take gas generated or gas consumed by metabolism, or gas entered or gas diffused into the blood by blood flow. So these two are the quantity that changes the volume of the gas inside a reservoir. That is one of the fundamental law that is used to model this system. And you see, I have given some mathematical relation, but the functions I have not explicitly written because these functions are very large. What you can do, you can get those papers and you can see those formulas. But for the discussion sake or for this course sake, I don't think that means giving you this long equation will be helpful to you. So the point I am trying to make here, for each compartment we have two equations. One equation is PaCO2, this pressure for arterial alveolar carbon dioxide. Now here you see there are three levels of suffixes are there. There is one level of suffix, that is CO2 or O2. That CO2 O2 depicts whether it is for carbon dioxide or it is for oxygen. Now there is another term suffix, that is A. That A means it can be a alveolar. If it is B, that means a brain. If it is T, that means it is tissue. And here this P denotes the pressure. So that means this variable means pressure of alveolar compartment of the carbon dioxide. Now remember that this is not that this kind of terminology, they are set by some international body. Those international bodies, they have defined this kind of nomenclature. Now there is this PaO2, PaCO2. So for alveolar compartment, we have a carbon dioxide partial pressure and oxygen partial pressure, and they are all dependent upon brain compartment carbon dioxide, tissue compartment carbon dioxide, alveolar compartment carbon dioxide, inspired carbon dioxide, the minute ventilation, and the brain blood flow. Similarly, you will find that the PtCO2, the tissue compartment, having two equations. One is the partial pressure of tissue, the carbon dioxide, and another is the partial pressure of oxygen. Similarly, the brain compartment is having two equations: partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the brain, partial pressure of oxygen inside the brain, and they are all having a separate equations or separate relations. And there are some blood flow is there. Blood flow is also another function. And the minute ventilation, that ventilation equation I have given. Now here you see, when a variable PaCO2 inside bracket T minus tau P is given, that kind of representation means that PaCO2 variable, that after tau P delay, that is affecting, that is working here. So similarly, PaO2 after tau P delay, that variable is working here. Okay. So that is the only one of the equation that I thought that I might show you for your understanding that what might be the other equations look like. So this is the algebraic equation you might see from this one, and these are all differential equations. Now the minimal model, as I told you, that the minimal model, they are used to verify certain hypotheses. And here I am only showing you the model of Badgel and Tran. So they have proposed one model to where they have considered only alveolar compartment and only one chemoreceptor, peripheral chemoreceptor. But the minute ventilation, what they considered, there is a different type of controller. Minute ventilation in the earlier model, they have considered a gray type controller. Here they have considered a Lloyd and Cunningham type controller. So this is specific to the model one. Now what they do is they have only two state equations, PaCO2 dot and PaO2 dot. That means partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolar compartment and partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolar compartment. And only they have given the peripheral controller or peripheral chemoreceptor part, and there is one single delay, tau. That means the delay from the lungs compartment to the peripheral chemoreceptor component. Those delays is considered. Now here you see, that is the point of whole discussion, that if we have some kind of model, how this system behaves. So making or proposing a system is not sufficient. We need to analyze this system also. So when we analyze the system, they found the equilibrium point of the system is at 41 millimeter mercury and 82 millimeter mercury. So that is our normal blood oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration. That means if you open up, if you analyze somebody's blood, a person's healthy person's blood, you'll find the oxygen partial pressure is 40 millimeter, near about 40 millimeter mercury, and the oxygen is around 82 millimeter mercury. Now what do we do with this? We do the linearization part. Once we do the linearization, it becomes in the state space format, and we have a coefficient matrix of A and AD. A means till now or till our UG level or PG level, what we usually study of the differential equation or the state space model as x dot t equals to A multiplied by 60. Now this term plus AD xt minus tau, this kind of term that creates a lot of problem in analysis. Because you see, if the system is like this only, x dot t is equals to axt, we know what is the fundamental solution and what is how the system is going to behave. But once this term is added, AD xt minus tau, that becomes very difficult to analyze, and that is not usually taught in the textbook. So for that means it is not like that it is impossible, but it is not in the textbook format. That is why I thought that there are some analysis techniques that you can go through if you want. For time delay system, there are many approaches, but fundamentally there are two approaches. One is called frequency domain approach, another is time domain approach. Now the frequency domain approach, there are many techniques. One is called pseudo delay technique. There is 2D stability test, etc. There are many techniques out there. And there is another time, the time domain approach. There is mainly two approaches. One is called Lyapunov-Krasovsky approach or Lyapunov-Krasovsky functional. Another is Lyapunov-Rajumikin. Oh, I wrote this wrongly. This should be Lyapunov-Rajumikin functional theorem. So there are two approaches in time domain approach. And if you go through this book, you'll find out about this detailed technique. Now here one thing to remember is that this frequency domain approach, they can only handle a system with single delay. If there are multiple delays in system, only we have to resort to the time domain approach, this Lyapunov-Krasovsky and Lyapunov-Rajumikin. And then again, in this time delay system, what we can say or what we can understand is that we can have certain amount of limit. Means we cannot say that the system is going to be stable for all these things, all the delay value. In time delay system, the analysis techniques are told, but the analysis point or the purpose of analysis that we want to find out what is the limit of the delay or what is the limit of some parameters that makes the system unstable. So if a system is having small delay, the system may remain stable. But if the system's delay becomes higher, the system may become unstable. So similarly, if we change some of the parameters, that can also that can also change the stability property. Or it may happen the system is insensitive to delay. So if I am changing the delay to let's say infinite delay I am giving, but the system is still stable. Now we want this knowledge of time delay system into respiratory system. And it is found out that when a system goes or in the periodic condition, what happens? You see, this is our PaO2, this is our PaCO2. So those two variables, the nominal value we have shown. The nominal value PaCO2 is 41 and PaO2 is 82. So what happens in case if they start oscillation, they will oscillate around this nominal value. What means the important point is what does this represent? It represents that the system is unstable. Now, saying that unstable, that is actually wrong, because from control system point of view, if a system is unstable, that means the state should go to infinity. But physiologically, the state cannot go to infinity. What they can do is maximum, they will oscillate. But you need to understand one thing, that what the control system is telling, if we want to understand that concept in physiological system, changing the variable in a slightest value, that will make a person uncomfortable. Okay. So that means when the oxygen or carbon dioxide is oscillating in this way, that means it is enough problem for a person, and that need to be a clinical diagnosis is required. But for mathematical understanding, what we can say is that the system is not normal, or the system is not working or not stable. Okay. It may be, it is not unstable, but it is marginally stable, means from control system point of view, but from physiological system of view, the system is not normal. Okay, now this is the model that I wanted to show you, give you the picture as how these systems are interconnected. So here you see this breathing mechanism or this mechanical plant. There are two outputs. It is having two outputs. One is creating this airflow. Another is this minute ventilation. This minute ventilation is coming to the chemical regulation model, and the chemical regulation model is generating, or that is creating this signal as alveolar carbon dioxide, alveolar oxygen, and brain carbon dioxide. And those values are fed through these chemoreceptors to the respiratory controller. And from there, this is a hypothesis that we have proposed, that there is a modulator and demodulator inside the neural system that is creating this kind of signal that is given to the respiratory muscles. Now let us discuss about the respiratory homeostasis. Now homeostasis means that some quantity need to be at a constant value. Now in case of respiratory system, it should be oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now if the homeostasis fails, so how it is failing or where it is failing? One of the simulation that I shown you, that the arterial gases starts oscillating. But that is one of the condition, that is periodic breathing condition. What happens? The equilibrium point changes. So there are two diseases that we could identify from the physiology. One is called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Another is called periodic breathing. Periodic breathing, that simulation I shown you. In COPD condition, what happens? It is a very slow disease. And what happens is, the arterial gas concentration gradually becomes very low. So the oxygen saturation for a healthy person, if it is 98%, for COPD person, it may become 90% or 80%. And that is one of the reason what the experts are telling today, that this is one of the comorbidity factor for this COVID-19. That if a person is already having a lower oxygen concentration or oxygen content inside the body, that is means very much detrimental itself. Now, if means added this virus, that will also lower the oxygen content inside the body. Similar to the periodic breathing also. The periodic breathing means that it can happen in many conditions, like it can be a higher altitude or some sleep apnea, those kind of things. But again, means if the virus is there, then that will also increase the chance of making it oscillatory. Now, here you must understand one thing, that in this chemical regulation model, means this part, that is the main part, they are working to regulate, or they are working to regulate the oxygen and carbon dioxide value. Otherwise, this part, that is only a mechanical part, and they are only the neural control. But the system wise, this system is the most important one, which is responsible for creating the homeostasis. If something happens that will affect this homeostasis, then we need to give either additional oxygen or some additional pressure. And this kind of thing needs some expert clinician. So without that expert clinician, it's very difficult. Now let us discuss about briefly about this COPD, and periodic breathing also I will give. Now COPD is not a single disease actually. COPD is a group of disease, and the most common are called emphysema and chronic bronchitis. In this condition, what happens is that the air sacs of the lungs, they gradually destroy, and the airflow becomes very less. And the bronchitis that causes inflammation and the narrowing of bronchial tube, which allows mucus to build up. So that means in our mechanical plant, what happens is that there is the passage of airway that gradually becomes smaller. Now, in periodic breathing condition, there are many conditions that creates the periodic breathing, or there are certain clinical condition that generates or that creates this periodic breathing. One is called this obstructive sleep apnea. It is something that the breathing repeatedly stop and start during sleep, and this is caused by the throat muscles intermittently relax. Means the throat muscles, if they block the airway during sleep, it will create this obstructive sleep apnea. And the central sleep apnea that occurs because when the brain does not send proper signals to the muscles, and that also create another kind of apnea. And sometimes a person can be affected by both of these kind of apnea, that is called mixed sleep apnea. There is another kind of disease that is called congestive heart failure. In congestive heart failure, what happens is that the person's heart sends inadequate amount of blood, or it cannot pump sufficient blood. So what happens is that the blood means sufficient, it cannot bind sufficient amount of oxygen, and it will create, it will generate this periodic breathing, and that kind of thing is called congestive heart failure. Now there is this therapy that is called oxygen therapy. In oxygen therapy, what happens? You see, what I discussed all these things, or why I discussed all these things, because when you study a control system, if it is a system, there are two things you can understand, or two aspects of a system you can understand. One is the shifting of the equilibrium point. Another is the system goes into the oscillatory condition. So physiologically means whatever you can understand in control system point of view, that thing you can correlate in the physiological system. Okay. Now the therapy wise is oxygen therapy. That is one of the most uh, popular therapy, and they are used for acute conditions. It is not like that a person is suffering from very low kind of disease and a person is provided oxygen. No, it is not like that. It is usually prescribed by a medical practitioner, and it is given with several kind of instruction that you should not get this much oxygen or more than this, because if you give more than required oxygen, what happens? There is a term called oxygen toxicity, and that means the reason for that oxygen toxicity is that it cannot means when a person gets enough oxygen, the system thinks that I am having enough oxygen and I don't need to breathe. So what it will do, it will seize the respiratory effort, and that will build up the carbon dioxide. So this is the detrimental effect of oxygen therapy, and that is why this oxygen titration procedure is done by expert clinician. So what they do is they provide the oxygen through the mask, and they see what is the oxygen saturation coming. So if the oxygen saturation is in a desired value or near a desired value, it will be means that value is fixed. So they do not usually change that value. So that is the value that for that therapy. Now that is what I wanted to show you, that increasing the delay that makes the system oscillatory. So for the first 10 minutes, the system is in a stable condition. Okay. Now what happens? I am increasing the delay. What will do? It will make the system unstable. Now again, in the third condition, what I am doing, I am increasing the inspired oxygen, and it is making the system stable. So this kind of simulation that shows us that the oxygen therapy means what we are doing practically, that is also valid theoretically, or rather some theoretical validation that we can do. Okay, so there are some discussions there. So if there is any question, I will be happy to take that. These are some of the references you can see. Thank you for your attention. If there is any question, let us take that question.
Let's have Q&A session now. Audience, you can please ask the questions to Dr. Tanmay if you have any from the session. I can see some people are asking the feedback link in the chat window. The feedback link would be shared on day 5 after the completion of the course. Immediately after the completion of the course, we shall be sharing the feedback link.
So any question from there?
If there is no question, we can conclude the session at the moment. So join us tomorrow morning in that case. 11 a.m. we have talk by Dr. S.K. Pahuja from NIT Jalandhar. We would be talking about physiological control systems as well as feto-maternal monitoring. Thanks a lot, Dr. Tanmay.
Thank you, Dr. Jain. Okay. So thank you, everybody.
Yes. So we are closing the session right now. So we shall meet tomorrow again at 11 a.m. So dear participants, greetings from NIT Jalandhar. We shall see you tomorrow morning.
Their feedback link?
It will be shared on day 5.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.